What ancient weapons would still be practical today? Story 1. Poison is one of those ancient weapons that never really became obsolete. It just became so effective and so horrific that the world collectively agreed it shouldn't be used. Long before modern warfare, people were poisoning wells, coating arrows, and assassinating enemies with toxic substances. And the basic idea hasn't changed at all. What makes it stand out is that it doesn't rely on strength, speed, or even direct confrontation. A small amount, used in the right way, can have a massive impact. That's exactly why it carried over into more modern forms like chemical weapons, which eventually led to international bans because of how indiscriminate and brutal they are. Unlike a sword or spear, poison doesn't need advanced technology to remain effective. The same principles that worked centuries ago still work now, which is why it's considered so dangerous. It can spread, linger, and affect people far beyond the intended target, making it unpredictable and hard to control. That's also why it's heavily restricted under international agreements, because once it's used, the consequences aren't limited to a battlefield or a single moment. So, in a way, poison is still practical, but only in the sense that it had to be banned to stop people from using it. It didn't become outdated, it became unacceptable. Story 2. Guard dogs have been practical weapons for thousands of years, and honestly, they still are. Long before modern security systems, people relied on trained dogs for protection, and that hasn't really changed, just evolved. Dogs have this combination of traits that makes them incredibly effective: strong senses, loyalty, speed, and the ability to react instantly. Ancient armies used them in battle, while households and settlements used them as early warning systems and deterrents. Even the presence of a trained dog is often enough to stop trouble before it starts. What makes them stand out compared to a lot of ancient weapons is that they don't rely on outdated technology or materials. A well-trained dog can track, guard, and defend in ways that are still useful today, whether it's military, police work, or personal security. And unlike something like a sword or spear, they adapt. Training methods improve, breeds are selected for specific tasks, and they can work alongside modern equipment rather than being replaced by it. You'll still see them used for patrols, detection, and protection all over the world. It's one of those rare cases where an ancient weapon never really became obsolete. It just kept getting better over time. Story 3. Shields are one of the clearest examples of an ancient weapon that never really went out of style, they just changed roles. Thousands of years ago, soldiers carried shields into battle for protection against arrows, spears, and swords. Today, you still see essentially the same concept in use, especially with riot police. Modern riot units use protective shields to block thrown objects, blunt force, and even projectiles like rubber bullets. The materials are different: lightweight composites, transparent polycarbonate, but the idea is identical. Create a mobile barrier between you and whatever is coming at you. What makes shields so practical is how simple and adaptable they are. You don't need advanced technology for the concept to work, just something strong enough to absorb or deflect impact. That's why they've survived for so long, while so many other ancient weapons became obsolete. They also work well in coordinated formations. Just like ancient soldiers formed shield walls, modern police can line up and create a moving barrier, controlling space and protecting each other. It's kind of fascinating that despite all the advancements in warfare and technology, one of the oldest defensive tools ever invented is still being used in almost the exact same way, just updated for a different kind of battlefield. Story 4. Fire is one of those weapons that never became outdated. It just got more advanced delivery systems. Back in the day, armies were literally flinging burning materials over walls with catapults, or using things like Greek fire to set ships and cities ablaze. It was simple, brutal, and very effective. Fast forward to modern times, and the core idea hasn't changed at all, just the scale and technology. Instead of catapults, you've got aircraft and advanced munitions. Things like napalm and white phosphorus are essentially more controlled, engineered ways of using fire in combat. The goal is still the same: create intense heat, destruction, and area denial. What makes fire so consistently practical is that it doesn't rely on precision in the same way as other weapons. It spreads, consumes, and creates chaos. That's exactly why it's been used for thousands of years and still shows up in modern conflicts in various forms. At the same time, it's also controversial for that exact reason. Fire-based weapons can be extremely destructive and hard to contain, which is why their use is often restricted or heavily scrutinized under international law. So, like poison, it's not that fire became obsolete. It's that it remained effective enough to require rules around how and when it can be used. Story 5. That idea pops up a lot, but it's a bit more myth than reality. The concept behind it does make sense though, which is why it keeps getting repeated. Bows are incredibly quiet compared to firearms, which is why people imagine units like United States Navy SEALs wanting to use them for stealth. In theory, a bow could be useful for certain niche situations where noise discipline is critical, and historically, bows were the stealth weapon before gunpowder. But in practice, modern suppressed firearms already fill that role way better. They're still relatively quiet, but far more reliable, faster to use, easier to aim under stress, and effective at much greater distances. A bow requires more skill, more setup time, and has way more limitations in a combat environment. There are also legal and operational considerations. Modern militaries follow strict rules about issued equipment, logistics, and standardization. You can't just swap in something like a hunting bow because it might be useful in a specific scenario. So, it's not so much that bows are banned, it's that they've been completely outclassed by modern tools that do the same job more efficiently. That said, the fact people even consider it shows how practical ancient weapons like bows still are in principle. They just don't compete at the same level anymore. Story 6, Greek fire is one of those ancient weapons that honestly still sounds terrifying, even by modern standards. The Byzantines used it as a kind of early incendiary weapon, basically a burning liquid that could be projected onto enemy ships. And the worst part was that it kept burning even on water. That's what made it so effective. You couldn't just throw water on it and expect it to go out. In fact, that often made it worse. Once it stuck to something, wood, sails, even people, it would keep burning and spread. For naval warfare back then, it was basically a nightmare scenario. And the exact formula? Lost to history. People have theories, petroleum-based mixtures, quicklime, sulfur, but nobody knows for sure, which just adds to the mystique. What's interesting is that the concept absolutely still exists today. Modern incendiary weapons work on similar principles, creating intense, hard-to-extinguish fires. So, Greek fire wasn't just a one-off weird invention. It was an early version of something that's still considered effective enough to be used and regulated now. It's one of those cases where an ancient weapon wasn't just practical, it was so effective that its modern equivalents are heavily restricted. So, yeah, can't stop that crap is honestly a pretty accurate summary. Story 7. Spears are probably the best example of an ancient weapon that never actually disappeared, they just got upgraded. What we call a bayonet today is basically a spear tip attached to a rifle instead of a wooden shaft. Same concept, just modernized. And the reason they have stuck around for thousands of years is simple: reach matters. In close combat, having even a small extension between you and someone trying to hurt you is a huge advantage. That hasn't changed from ancient battlefields to modern ones. That said, bayonets aren't nearly as central today as spears were back then. Modern combat is dominated by firearms, so situations where you actually need to fix a bayonet and fight hand-to-hand are pretty rare. But militaries still train for it because in extreme situations when things break down, ammo runs out, or distances collapse, that sharp thing on a stick suddenly becomes relevant again. There's also a psychological aspect. A soldier with a fixed bayonet looks more intimidating, and historically, charges with bayonets could break enemy morale even before contact. So, yeah, the spear never really went obsolete. It just got attached to something more powerful. It's kind of funny that after thousands of years of technological progress, one of the oldest weapons ever invented is still there, just bolted onto a gun instead of carved from wood. Story 8. Gunpowder is probably one of the best examples of an ancient invention that never became obsolete. It just kept evolving. It was first developed in China around the 9th century, originally for things like fireworks and early weapons, and somehow that same basic idea is still powering modern firearms today. The core concept hasn't changed at all. You ignite a chemical mixture, it rapidly expands, and that force propels something forward. Whether it's a primitive fire lance or a modern rifle, the underlying principle is exactly the same. Of course, what has changed is everything around it. Modern propellants are far more refined, stable, and efficient than early gunpowder. Weapons are more accurate, reliable, and powerful, but at its heart, it's still controlled combustion doing the work. That's what makes it so interesting compared to other ancient weapons. Swords, spears, bows, they either became niche or were replaced by better tools. Gunpowder didn't get replaced. It became the foundation for everything that came after. It's kind of wild to think that something discovered over 1,000 years ago is still central to how warfare works today. Not many inventions get that kind of staying power. Story 9. A mace is one of those weapons that never really loses relevance because it's built on something very simple. Hit hard, and it works. You don't need fine technique, perfect edge alignment, or even much training compared to bladed weapons. It's just concentrated blunt force, and that's always going to be effective. Historically, maces were especially useful against armored opponents. Swords might glance off or struggle to penetrate, but a solid udar with a mace could dent armor, break bones, or at least incapacitate someone through sheer force. It didn't rely on precision so much as impact. That's why the modern comparison people make, like a collapsible baton, actually holds up pretty well. It's not designed to cut or pierce. It's meant to deliver controlled blunt force to stop someone. Same core idea, just adapted for modern use and rules of engagement. What makes blunt weapons so practical is that they're forgiving. You don't have to aim perfectly, you don't have to maintain a sharp edge, and they still do their job under stress. So, while the battlefield has changed completely, the underlying principle hasn't. If you strip away all the technology, a solid piece of metal swung with force is still a very effective tool, just like it was hundreds or even thousands of years ago. Story 10. Basic military strategy is probably the most ancient weapon that never stopped being useful, because it's not tied to technology at all. You can swap swords for rifles, horses for tanks, but the underlying ideas don't really change. When you read The Art of War by Sun Tzu, it feels obvious, almost common sense. Don't fight on your enemy's terms, use deception, know your strengths and weaknesses, control terrain, strike when the opponent is vulnerable. It reads like things everyone already knows. And like you said, the reason it feels that way is because everyone does it. Those principles have been absorbed into military thinking for centuries. They have been tested, refined, and passed down to the point where they're just baked into how people approach conflict. What's interesting is that these ideas apply way beyond warfare too. Business, sports, negotiations, anywhere there is competition. That's why the book is still recommended today. It's not about ancient China, it's about patterns of behavior that don't really change. Unlike a physical weapon that can become outdated, strategy evolves but doesn't expire. The tools change, but the logic behind using them effectively stays the same. So, yeah, in a way, the most practical ancient weapon isn't something you can hold. It's the mindset behind how you use everything else. Story 11. It's a fun idea, but a modern tactical trebuchet wouldn't actually make much sense outside of very niche situations. The core problem is that everything a trebuchet does. Modern systems already do way better. Trebuchets were great for their time because they could launch heavy objects without gunpowder, but they're slow to set up, slow to reload, and not very precise compared to modern weapons. Even if you blacked it out, added sensors, and optimized the mechanics, you're still dealing with a massive structure that's hard to move, easy to spot, and limited in range and rate of fire. Modern artillery, mortars, and rockets already solve those problems. They're faster, more accurate, easier to deploy, and can hit targets at much greater distances. Plus, they can adjust fire in real time in ways a mechanical system like a trebuchet just can't match. That said, the principle behind it, launching projectiles using stored energy, is still alive and well. You see it in things like electromagnetic launch systems, aircraft catapults, even experimental railguns. So, the idea didn't die, it just evolved into something far more efficient. If anything, a modernized trebuchet would be more of an engineering novelty or a psychological weapon than a practical one. Still, yeah, it would look insanely cool. Story 12. Longbows are one of those weapons that really blur the line between ancient and still genuinely effective. A well-made longbow, especially something like the English warbow, could deliver serious power, enough to penetrate armor under the right conditions, and at a range that's honestly impressive even today. Compared to crossbows, longbows had a big advantage in rate of fire and range, but they came with a huge trade-off: skill. You needed years of training to use one effectively. That's the part people often underestimate. A trained archer could be incredibly precise and fast, but getting to that level took a lifetime. From a purely physical standpoint, they're still very capable. Modern longbows used in sport or hunting can be extremely accurate and powerful. So, in terms of raw performance, they haven't really become obsolete. But in a modern military context, they get outclassed quickly. Firearms are easier to use, require far less training to be effective, work in more conditions, and have far greater range and stopping power. A rifle can do in seconds what takes an archer years to master. That said, the longbow's strengths, silence, reliability, and precision in skilled hands are exactly why people still bring it up in these discussions. It's one of those weapons that didn't stop working, it just got replaced by something more practical at scale. Story 13. Taking into assumption the ancient aliens' version of history is accurate, then yeah. Alien lasers would easily be one of the most practical ancient weapons ever conceived. If some advanced civilization had handed early humans directed energy weapons, they'd still be insanely useful today. No recoil, high precision, and potentially massive destructive power. It's basically the dream weapon in a lot of sci-fi. The funny part is that the idea sounds ridiculous at first, but modern technology is actually heading in that direction anyway. Real-world militaries are already experimenting with laser systems for things like shooting down drones, missiles, and other incoming threats. So, while the ancient alien angle isn't credible, the concept itself isn't fantasy anymore. It's just very modern and still developing. What makes lasers so appealing is how clean and precise they are compared to traditional weapons. No physical projectiles, minimal travel time, and the ability to hit targets almost instantly. If something like that had existed thousands of years ago, it wouldn't just still be practical today. It would probably dominate everything else. Of course, the big difference is that modern lasers require huge amounts of power and complex systems to operate. That's the part that keeps them from being widely used right now, and also what makes the ancient alien idea fall apart. Still, it's kind of ironic. The History Channel version is wrong, but the future they're hinting at, that part might actually be real. Story 14. A full Roman legionary kit is one of those setups that, surprisingly, would still hold its own in very specific situations today. Not against modern firearms, obviously, but in close combat or low-tech environments, it's incredibly well thought out. The gladius was designed for tight, efficient stabbing and formation, not flashy swordplay, just quick, lethal movements. Pair that with the scutum, a large curved shield, and you've got both offense and serious protection. The pilum adds a ranged component, designed to bend on impact so enemies couldn't throw it back, which is honestly a clever bit of engineering. Then there's the armor, like Lorica segmentata, which offered a solid balance of protection and mobility. It wasn't invincible, but it was practical, repairable, and effective for the kind of combat they fought. What really makes the whole kit stand out, though, isn't any single piece. It's how everything works together. Roman soldiers fought as a unit, not as individuals. Shields overlapped, formations held, and discipline did most of the work. Even today, that level of coordination would be hard to deal with in a purely close-quarters scenario. And yeah, throw in something like a ballista, and you've basically got ancient long-range firepower that can still do serious damage to structures or light targets. It's a reminder that sometimes effectiveness isn't about advanced tech. It's about how well everything is designed to work together. Story 15. The Nepalese kukri is one of those rare ancient weapons that's still not just relevant today, but actively used. It's been carried for centuries by Gurkha soldiers, and there's a reason it never really got replaced. The design is deceptively simple, but incredibly effective. That forward curving blade shifts the weight toward the tip, which means when you swing it, it hits with way more force than a straight knife of the same size. It's part knife, part machete, part axe, all in one tool. You can chop, slice, stab, and even use it for everyday tasks like cutting wood or preparing food. That versatility is what makes it so practical. A lot of ancient weapons were designed purely for combat, but the kukri works just as well as a utility tool. In real-world conditions, that matters a lot more than having something specialized. And it's not just ceremonial or historical either. Gurkhas still carry and train with kukris today, not because they have to, but because it's reliable, durable, and brutally effective in close quarters. It's one of those weapons where the original design was so good that it didn't need to evolve much. No high-tech upgrades, no major redesigns, just a solid piece of steel shaped in exactly the right way. Out of everything on the list, the kukri might be one of the clearest examples of an ancient weapon that never really became outdated. Story 16, if we're counting Avatar. The last airbender level logic, then yeah, firebending is definitely the most overpowered ancient weapon imaginable. Control over fire on demand, instant offense, defense, area denial, mobility if you're good enough. It basically checks every box. No need for fuel, no need for equipment, no reload time. Just pure, continuous output limited only by the user's Sealand stamina. What makes it especially broken is versatility. You're not just throwing fireballs, you can create walls of flame, control the battlefield, intimidate opponents, and in some versions, even generate lightning. Compared to actual historical weapons, it's not even a fair comparison. Of course, in reality, humans can't bend fire, so it stays firmly in the fantasy category. But it's funny how it still follows the same logic as real, practical weapons. Simple to deploy, adaptable, and effective in multiple scenarios. If something like that did exist in the real world, it wouldn't just still be practical today, it would completely redefine warfare. So, yeah, not historically accurate, but definitely top tier. Story 17. Biological weapons are another example where the idea is ancient, but the implications today are far more serious. Historically, there are accounts of armies catapulting diseased bodies over city walls to spread illness, a crude and terrifying form of early biological warfare. Fast forward to modern times, and the concept has evolved into something far more controlled and dangerous in theory, using pathogens that can spread rapidly and affect large populations. That's exactly why they're heavily restricted under international agreements like the Biological Weapons Convention. What makes them stand out is how disproportionate their impact can be. You don't need large forces or direct confrontation. The effects can spread on their own, which also makes them incredibly unpredictable and hard to contain. That unpredictability is a big part of why they're considered unacceptable in modern warfare. So, like poison and fire, it's not that the concept became obsolete, it's that it remained so effective and so dangerous beyond control that the global response was to ban it. It's one of those ancient weapons where the principle still works, but the consequences are too severe for it to be considered a viable or acceptable option today. Story 18, probably not quite Babylonian superweapons. That claim gets exaggerated a lot. But the ideas behind flamethrowers and torpedoes are definitely ancient and still very relevant. Early versions of flame weapons did exist, most famously Greek fire used by the Byzantines. They had siphon-like devices that could project burning liquid onto enemy ships, which is basically a primitive flamethrower. It was terrifying, hard to extinguish, and incredibly effective in naval combat. That concept carried forward directly into modern flamethrowers, just with better fuel, pressure systems, and control. Torpedoes are a bit different. The Babylonians didn't have anything like modern torpedoes, especially not gunpowder-powered ones, skimming across water. But the concept of attacking ships from a distance using floating or submerged weapons evolved later, especially in the 19th century, with self-propelled torpedoes. Before that, there were things like explosive boats or drifting mines, which are closer ancestors. So, while the historical details are off, the core idea is right. Both fire projection and water-based explosive delivery systems have deep roots, and both are still very much practical today, just heavily regulated or replaced with more advanced versions. It's a good example of how people sometimes compress centuries of development into one story, but underneath it, there's usually a real evolutionary thread connecting ancient concepts to modern weapons. Story 19, psychological warfare is probably the most timeless weapon on this list, because it doesn't depend on technology at all. It depends on perception. If you can shape what your enemy thinks is happening, you can influence what they actually do. That's been true since ancient times. Armies would exaggerate their numbers, use noise and formations to appear larger, spread rumors, or stage displays meant to intimidate. The goal wasn't just to fight the enemy, but to break their confidence before the fight even started. And it still works today, just on a much bigger scale. Modern operations combine messaging, misinformation, cyber activity, and intelligence gathering to influence decisions without direct confrontation. The core idea hasn't changed. Make the opponent hesitate, miscalculate, or overreact. It's especially powerful when you're facing a stronger force. If you can convince them you're more capable, more prepared, or more dangerous than you actually are, you level the playing field without needing equal strength. Sometimes the threat of action is more effective than action itself. What makes psychological warfare so practical is that it multiplies everything else. A small force can appear large, a weak position can seem strong, a risky move can look calculated. Out of all ancient strategies, this is the one that never went obsolete, because as long as humans are involved, perception will always matter as much as reality. Alright, what's the scenario? Story 20. Hands are probably the most fundamental weapon of all, not because of brute force, but because they are the interface for everything else. Every tool, every system, every piece of technology ultimately depends on human input, and hands are how that input happens. On their own, they're already capable of a lot. They can strike, grapple, restrain, and manipulate with a level of precision no other C part can match. You don't need training to use them at a basic level, but with training, they become incredibly effective, whether that's in combat sports, self-defense, or military close-quarter situations. But what really makes them powerful is what you pointed out. They scale. The same hands that can throw a punch can also wield a blade, operate machinery, or control advanced systems. There's a direct line from the most primitive form of combat to the most advanced, and hands are the constant link across all of it. Every weapon ever made, from a stone spear to a modern firearm, only becomes practical because someone can hold it, aim it, and use it. Even at the highest level, pressing a button, turning a key, entering a command, it all comes back to that same physical connection. So yeah, everything else on the list is secondary. Tools change, technology evolves, but hands are the one weapon that never gets replaced, because they're what make all the others possible. Story 21. Yeah, explosives are actually pretty ancient, just not in the form we think of today. The earliest true explosive is gunpowder, which was developed in China around the 9th century. At first, it was used for things like fireworks and simple incendiary devices, but it didn't take long before people realized it could be weaponized. Early explosives were pretty crude though. Gunpowder burns fast and can explode in confined spaces, but it's not nearly as powerful as modern high explosives. Still, it was enough to create bombs, primitive grenades, rockets, and eventually firearms. So, the basic concept, rapid energy release to cause damage, has been around for over 1,000 years. What changed over time is the chemistry. In the 19th century, things like nitroglycerin and dynamite massively increased explosive power. Then later came even more stable and powerful compounds used in modern munitions. So, while the strength and efficiency have improved a lot, the underlying idea hasn't really changed. That's what makes explosives fit this topic so well. Like fire or poison, they didn't become obsolete. They just evolved into more advanced versions. So, yeah, explosives aren't just modern. They're one of the longest-running technologies in warfare, just refined over centuries into what we see today. Story 22, deception is probably the most universally practical ancient weapon there is, because it works in literally every era, with or without technology. From the Trojan horse to modern misinformation campaigns, the core idea hasn't changed at all. Make your opponent believe something false, and they'll make the wrong decision for you. No strength, no advanced tools, just controlling perception. What makes deception so powerful is that it bypasses direct confrontation. Instead of overpowering someone, you get them to misjudge reality, underestimate you, overestimate themselves, or act at the wrong time. A weaker force can beat a stronger one simply by shaping what the stronger one thinks is happening, and it scales incredibly well. On a small level, it's feints and ambushes. On a larger scale, it's fake troop movements, false intelligence, or entire operations built around misleading the enemy, like Operation Fortitude before D-Day. It also pairs perfectly with intelligence and counterintelligence. The better you understand your opponent, the easier it is to feed them exactly the wrong information in a believable way. That's why it never goes obsolete. Weapons change, battlefields change. But as long as humans are making decisions, deception will always work. It's not just a tactic, it's a force multiplier for everything else. Story 23. Ballistae are one of those ancient weapons that feel like they should still be terrifying, and in a very limited sense, they would be. A large torsion-powered ballista could launch heavy bolts with serious force at range, and if you add fire, you were basically turning it into an early incendiary launcher. Against wooden structures or unprotected targets, that's still dangerous. But this is where reality kicks in a bit. Compared to modern weapons, ballistae are slow, bulky, and not very flexible. You've got a low rate of fire, limited mobility, and accuracy that depends heavily on setup and conditions. Against modern soldiers with firearms, optics, and mobility, a ballista would struggle to even get a shot off before being neutralized. That said, the principle behind it absolutely survived. Launching projectiles at range using stored mechanical energy is something we still do, just with far more efficient systems. Modern artillery, rockets, and even some experimental launch systems are basically the evolved version of that same idea. And if you drop the modern battlefield comparison and think in terms of low-tech or improvised scenarios, then yeah, a ballista could still do serious damage, especially psychologically. Something silently launching massive bolts or flaming projectiles is not something people are used to dealing with. So it's not really practical today in a direct sense, but the concept behind it definitely never died. It just evolved into something much faster and more precise. Story 24. The Ark of the Covenant is one of those answers that sits right on the line between history, religion, and legend. According to the Bible, it wasn't just a sacred object. It was described as having overwhelming power, capable of bringing down enemies, causing plagues, or even killing people who touched it improperly. If you take those descriptions at face value, then yeah, it would be the most practical ancient weapon imaginable. No training, no logistics, just an object whose presence alone could devastate opponents. That's why in the narratives, it was treated with extreme caution and reverence, not just as a religious artifact, but as something potentially dangerous. But outside of those accounts, there's no verified evidence that the Ark had any kind of supernatural destructive ability, or even that it exists today. Most historians see it as a religious symbol, central to ancient Israelite culture rather than a literal weapon. What's interesting, though, is how it fits into the idea of psychological warfare. Even if you strip away the supernatural aspects, the belief that it had divine power could have had a huge impact on morale, both for those who carried it and those who faced it. So, whether you see it as a literal force or a symbolic one, it still fits the theme in a way, not as a practical weapon in the modern sense, but as something that, through belief and perception, could influence the outcome of conflict. Story 25. Politics is probably the most powerful ancient weapon that never stopped being relevant, because it controls who fights, why they fight, and whether they fight at all. Long before modern warfare, rulers were using alliances, marriages, treaties, and backroom deals to gain advantages without ever picking up a weapon. Entire wars have been won or avoided purely through negotiation or manipulation. In a lot of cases, politics achieves what armies can't, or makes armies unnecessary. What makes it so effective is that it operates above everything else. Weapons, strategy, intelligence, all of it ultimately answers to political decisions. A single agreement can end a conflict instantly, while a bad decision can start one just as fast. And like deception, it scales. On a small level, it's convincing a rival to stand down. On a larger level, it's shaping alliances, influencing populations, or isolating enemies. Modern examples include sanctions, diplomacy, and influence campaigns, all ways of applying pressure without direct combat. It's also incredibly subtle. Unlike a sword or a gun, you don't always see it working in real time, but the effects can be massive. Borders change, governments fall, wars begin or end, all without a single shot being fired. So, yeah, while it's not a weapon in the traditional sense, it might be the most practical one of all, because in the end, it decides how every other weapon gets used. Story 26. Disease is probably one of the most devastating weapons in human history, and it doesn't care about armies, borders, or technology. Long before modern warfare, outbreaks of plague, smallpox, and other illnesses wiped out entire populations, often doing more damage than any army could. What makes it so terrifying is that it spreads on its own. You don't need constant effort or resupply. Once it starts, it can move through populations, disrupt societies, and collapse systems without direct confrontation. That's exactly why it's been both feared and, at times in history, deliberately used in conflict. And unlike most ancient weapons, it never became obsolete. If anything, its potential impact has only become more obvious over time. That's also why the world has strict international agreements banning biological warfare, because once disease is involved, control becomes incredibly difficult. Even outside of warfare, disease has shaped the course of history in massive ways. determining the outcomes of wars, the rise and fall of empires, and the movement of populations. So, in terms of practicality, it's less about usefulness and more about raw impact. It's not something you can aim or control like a traditional weapon, which is exactly what makes it so dangerous. It's one of those forces that reminds you that not all weapons are tools. Some are just uncontrollable realities that humans have tried and often failed to manage. Story 27. The axe is one of the clearest examples of an ancient weapon that's still completely practical today, just not always in a battlefield sense. In forms like the tomahawk or a simple hatchet, it's basically the perfect mix of tool and weapon. What makes it so effective is versatility. It's not just for fighting, it's for chopping wood, breaching doors, clearing obstacles, building shelter, all the stuff that actually matters in real-world situations. A lot of ancient weapons were single-purpose, but an axe earns its place even when there's no combat at all. From a combat perspective, it's still very capable. It delivers heavy, concentrated force, can hook, strike, or break through materials, and doesn't rely on ammunition or complex maintenance. In close quarters, it's simple and brutally effective. That's why versions of it still show up in modern contexts, including military breaching tools and survival gear. It's not because it's outdated, it's because it solves problems that haven't changed. Like the kukri or the spear, the design is just right. There's not much to improve without changing what it fundamentally is. It's one of those rare cases where something invented thousands of years ago still earns its place, not out of tradition, but because it genuinely works. Story 28. We need to replace all our modern howitzers with Trebuchet catapults. Trebuchets are awesome from an engineering standpoint, but compared to modern artillery like a howitzer, they're completely outclassed. A trebuchet takes time to build, time to load, and time to fire. And even then, accuracy is pretty rough. A howitzer can fire rapidly, adjust aim precisely, and hit targets miles away with consistent results. The real difference is flexibility. Modern artillery can respond in seconds, change targets quickly, and operate from concealed positions. A trebuchet is basically a giant stationary structure that says, "Hey, I'm right here." Not ideal when the other side has drones, satellites, and long-range weapons. That said, the principle behind trebuchets, storing energy and releasing it to launch a projectile, is still alive. It's just evolved into things like artillery systems, rocket launchers, and even experimental tech. So the idea didn't die, it just got way more efficient. If anything, replacing howitzers with trebuchets would be less about practicality and more about psychological warfare. Imagine seeing a giant medieval siege engine roll up in the 21st century. You'd definitely have questions. Cool? Absolutely. Effective? Not even close. Story 29. Apparently, the sling is commonly used for returning tear gas canisters and the like. A sling is simple, lightweight, and surprisingly powerful. In ancient times, skilled slingers could hurl stones with serious force and range, enough to injure or even kill. The mechanics are basic, but once you get the technique down, it's an efficient way to launch objects without needing any modern equipment. In modern protest or riot situations, people have been known to improvise with whatever they have, and a sling fits that perfectly. If tear gas canisters are being deployed, the ability to quickly pick one up and send it back from a safer distance is obviously useful. It doesn't require ammo, just the object already being used. What makes it practical is that it's low-tech and adaptable. No batteries, no moving parts that can fail, and easy to make from basic materials. It's the kind of tool that only shows up when conditions strip things down to the essentials. It's also a reminder that effectiveness doesn't always come from complexity. Sometimes, something thousands of years old still works because the underlying physics haven't changed at all. Story 30. The ancient Japanese tonfa is what cops carry as billy clubs. Originally from Okinawa, the tonfa was a wooden weapon with a side handle, which let the user switch between blocking and striking very quickly. You could hold it along your forearm for defense, then rotate it out for powerful strikes. That versatility is exactly what made it effective. Modern police batons took that core idea and simplified it. Straight batons are easier to carry and use with minimal training, while side-handle batons, like PR-24s, are actually much closer to the original Tonfa design. They keep that same ability to block, control, and strike using leverage. What makes this a great example for your topic is that nothing fundamental changed. The materials improved, the design got standardized, and the purpose shifted more toward control than combat, but the mechanics are basically identical. It's one of those cases where an ancient weapon didn't disappear, it just got rebranded and integrated into modern use. Story 31, Blackmail is one of those weapons that's been around forever, and somehow never lost its effectiveness. If anything, it's gotten stronger over time. Long before modern tech, people were already using secrets, scandals, and personal information as leverage. If you had something damaging on someone, you didn't need a sword or an army, you had control. What makes blackmail so powerful is that it attacks reputation instead of the body. In a lot of cases, that's even more devastating. A ruler, politician, or military leader might survive a battle, but if their credibility or image is destroyed, their influence can collapse instantly. That's been true in ancient courts, royal families, and political systems for centuries. And like deception or psychological warfare, it scales incredibly well. In the past, it might have been a whispered secret or a hidden letter. Today, it can involve digital records, leaked files, or massive data breaches. The tools changed, but the principle didn't. You control the information, you control the person. It's also hard to defend against. You can train for combat, build defenses, prepare strategies, but if someone has real leverage over you, there's no easy counter. That's why it's been used in espionage, politics, and power struggles across history. So, yeah, it's not a weapon you can see or hold, but it might be one of the most practical and enduring ones ever. Because as long as people have secrets, blackmail will always work. Story 32. The atlatl is one of those ancient weapons that people seriously underestimate until they see it in action. It looks simple, basically just a lever used to throw a dart, but that simplicity is exactly what makes it so effective. It massively increases the speed and force of a projectile, turning a thrown spear into something that can hit with surprising power and range. Before bows became widespread, the atlatl was the long-range weapon for a lot of cultures. Hunters used it to take down large game, and in combat, it could punch through armor or deliver lethal strikes from a distance. And unlike a bow, it doesn't require the same kind of complex construction or constant tension in materials, it's just leverage and physics doing the work. What's wild is that it's still completely viable today. People who practice with it can throw darts at high speeds with impressive accuracy, and yeah, in some places it's actually restricted for hunting because it's considered too effective or not in line with modern regulations. That alone says a lot. It also has a weird advantage in that it's low-tech but high-impact. No moving parts, no maintenance, nothing to jam or break easily. If you know how to use it, it works. It's one of those weapons where the design was so efficient from the start that it never really became obsolete. It just got overshadowed by more convenient options. Story 33. The plague is one of those weapons that doesn't need anyone actively using it to have a massive impact. But historically, people have absolutely treated disease like a tool, intentionally or not. Outbreaks like the Black Death reshaped entire continents, wiping out populations, collapsing economies, and shifting power structures overnight. You didn't need an army if disease was already doing the work for you. But what's really interesting is how that ties into something way less physical and way more subtle: control through distraction. The old Roman idea of bread and circuses wasn't about killing people, it was about controlling them. Keep people fed, entertained, and emotionally occupied, and they're less likely to question what's actually going on. It's not force, it's redirection. And that hasn't changed at all. Instead of arenas and grain, you've got media cycles, constant information streams, and manufactured outrage. The tools evolved, but the principle is identical. If people are focused on the wrong thing, you don't have to stop them directly, you just guide where their attention goes. What makes this so practical is that it doesn't look like a weapon. There's no battlefield, no obvious conflict, just influence. And like disease, once it spreads, it's hard to contain. Ideas, narratives, and distractions can move through populations just as effectively as anything physical. So, yeah, whether it's literal plague or metaphorical bread in circuses, both are about impact without direct confrontation, and that's why they've stuck around. Story 34. The Apple of Eden is one of those answers that leans more into mythology and symbolism than actual historical weapons, but it still fits surprisingly well when you think about it. In the biblical story of the book of Genesis, the fruit from the tree of knowledge, often depicted as an apple, isn't a weapon in the physical sense, but it completely changes the course of human history in a single moment. What makes it interesting is that it represents knowledge, awareness, and the consequences that come with them. Adam and Eve eat the fruit, gain understanding, and everything changes, innocence is gone, and the world becomes something entirely different. That's not brute force, it's transformation. If you look at it through the lens of this topic, it's less like a sword or spear, and more like an information weapon. Knowledge itself can be incredibly powerful. It can liberate, but it can also disrupt, destabilize, and reshape entire systems. That's been true throughout history, from scientific discoveries to political revelations. In modern terms, you could even compare it to things like classified information, leaks, or breakthroughs that shift the balance of power. The idea that a single piece of knowledge can change everything is still very real. So, while the Apple of Eden isn't something you could physically use in combat, the concept behind it, that knowledge can alter reality and power structures, is one of the most enduring and practical forces there is. Story 35. The human brain is probably the most powerful ancient weapon there is, because it's the thing that created every other weapon on this list. Long before swords, bows, or gunpowder, humans had the ability to think, adapt, and solve problems. And that's what gave them an edge over everything else. That quote really captures it perfectly. Humans weren't given claws, fangs, or natural armor like other animals. Instead, they were given intelligence, and that ended up being far more versatile. With it, humans learned to make tools, plan strategies, cooperate in groups, and outthink opponents rather than just overpower them. What makes the brain so practical is that it scales infinitely. It can invent a spear, then improve it into a sword, then replace it with a firearm, and eventually create things like missiles or cyber warfare. Every advancement in warfare, and honestly every advancement in general, comes back to that same source. It also ties directly into things like deception, strategy, and psychology. The most effective victories in history often didn't come from brute force, but from outthinking the enemy. Knowing when to fight, when not to fight, and how to manipulate a situation is something no physical weapon can replicate on its own. So, yeah, everything else is just an extension. The real weapon has always been the mind behind it. Story 36, Spies and Sabotage are probably some of the most consistently effective ancient weapons ever, because they attack a system from the inside instead of trying to overpower it from the outside. Long before modern intelligence agencies existed, civilizations were already sending scouts, informants, and infiltrators to gather information and weaken enemies without open conflict. A well-placed spy can do more damage than an entire army if they get the right information. Knowing troop movements, supply routes, or weaknesses in defenses can completely change the outcome of a battle before it even begins. And the scary part is, the target often doesn't even realize it's happening until it's too late. Sabotage takes that a step further. Instead of just gathering intel, it actively disrupts the enemy's ability to function. Cut off supplies, damage infrastructure, poison resources, or spread confusion, and suddenly a stronger force becomes vulnerable. Historically, small groups have managed to cripple much larger armies just by targeting the right weak points. What makes both of these so practical is that they scale incredibly well. You don't need massive resources, just training, patience, and precision. And like deception and psychological warfare, they rely more on intelligence than brute force. Even today, these concepts are still central to how conflicts are fought, just with more advanced tools. But the core idea hasn't changed at all. Don't fight the enemy head-on if you can quietly dismantle them from within. Story 37, Scorpion Pots, are one of those ideas that sound almost primitive and ridiculous, until you think about how effective they could actually be in the right context. Ancient forces are believed to have used containers filled with stinging or venomous creatures, like scorpions, and thrown or launched them into enclosed enemy spaces such as caves, tunnels, or fortifications. What makes it interesting is that it's not about direct force, it's about chaos. You're not trying to kill instantly, you're trying to panic, disrupt, and make the environment unbearable. In a confined space where people can't easily escape and don't know where the threat is coming from, something like that could cause total disorder very quickly. It's basically an early form of area denial and psychological warfare combined. Even if the actual physical damage is limited, the fear factor does a lot of the work. People don't fight well when they're suddenly dealing with dozens of venomous creatures crawling around them. Would it still work today? In a very narrow sense, sure. Anything that creates confusion and forces people out of a position can be effective, but compared to modern tools, it's unpredictable and hard to control, which is why it doesn't really have a place anymore. Still, it's a great example of how ancient warfare often relied on creativity over technology. You didn't need advanced weapons, just a nasty idea and a way to deliver it. Story 38, bees are one of those surprisingly effective ancient weapons that sound almost like a joke, until you realize how often they were actually used. There are accounts of defenders in ancient times throwing hives or containers of bees at attackers during sieges, and honestly, it makes a lot of sense. You're not trying to overpower the enemy directly, you're unleashing chaos. A swarm of angry bees doesn't care about armor, training, or discipline. Once they're agitated, they attack anything nearby, and suddenly a coordinated force turns into a panicked crowd. Even experienced soldiers can't fight effectively while getting swarmed and stung. What makes this especially nasty is that it bypasses most conventional defenses. Shields, weapons, formations, none of that really helps when the threat is tiny, fast, and everywhere at once. It's similar to things like scorpion pots, but arguably worse because bees can pursue targets and spread out over a wider area. And like a lot of the weapons in this thread, it's as much psychological as physical. Fear does a huge part of the work. Once people start panicking, the situation spirals quickly. Would it still cause a problem today? In the right situation, absolutely. You don't need advanced tech to disrupt people, just something that forces them to lose control. It's a great reminder that sometimes the most effective tools in conflict aren't the most advanced, they're just the most chaotic. Story 39, bees are one of those surprisingly effective ancient weapons that sound almost like a joke, until you realize how often they were actually used. There are accounts of defenders in ancient times throwing hives or containers of bees at attackers during sieges. And honestly, it makes a lot of sense. You're not trying to overpower the enemy directly, you're unleashing chaos. A swarm of angry bees doesn't care about armor, training, or discipline. Once they're agitated, they attack anything nearby, and suddenly a coordinated force turns into a panicked crowd. Even experienced soldiers can't fight effectively while getting swarmed and stung. What makes this especially nasty is that it bypasses most conventional defenses. Shields, weapons, formations, None of that really helps when the threat is tiny, fast, and everywhere at once. It's similar to things like scorpion pots, but arguably worse because bees can pursue targets and spread out over a wider area. And like a lot of the weapons in this thread, it's as much psychological as physical. Fear does a huge part of the work. Once people start panicking, the situation spirals quickly. Would it still cause a problem today? In the right situation, absolutely. You don't need advanced tech to disrupt people, just something that forces them to lose control. It's a great reminder that sometimes the most effective tools in conflict aren't the most advanced, they're just the most chaotic. Story 40, China having landmines as early as the 13th century, is one of those facts that really shows how far back some modern ideas actually go. These weren't like today's precision-engineered devices, but the core concept was already there, a hidden explosive triggered by an unsuspecting enemy. Early Chinese landmines used gunpowder packed into containers, often buried underground or concealed along paths. Some designs were triggered by pressure, others by trip mechanisms, and some even used more complex systems involving flint or delayed ignition. For something that old, the ingenuity is honestly impressive. What makes this so interesting is how little the idea has changed. Modern landmines are obviously far more advanced, more reliable triggers, more consistent explosives, but the principle is identical. You create a hidden danger that denies access to an area and forces the enemy to slow down, reroute, or risk serious damage. And that's exactly why they've remained practical, even if they're heavily restricted today. They don't require constant supervision. They work passively, and they can shape the battlefield long after they're placed. At the same time, that persistence is also what makes them controversial. They don't distinguish between soldiers and civilians, and they can remain dangerous for years or decades. So, yeah, like a lot of things in this thread, landmines didn't really become obsolete. They just became something the modern world tries to control because they work a little too well.